First, I'll just say that it's pretty remarkable that these beliefs are thousands of years old now, about 2,500 years old, and people probably had come to similar conclusions before we even developed written languages. So it is amazing what a little bit of experience and humility can do. I think discovering the fundamental truths of life are generally pretty easy. I would compare it to being slowly sucked into a black hole. Just let it happen, don't fight it. No matter how uncomfortable it is, wherever you start, you will end up in the very center, and it will tear asunder in the process. So, of course, we all fight it, we all swim against it, and we dare not stare at it. Ooh, it's spooky. But then our societies put up these roadblocks to prevent people from even being able to get near it. Of course, there's no real barrier powerful enough to prevent someone from waking from their slumber. So I'll preface my points on Buddhism by saying I'm fully aware a lot of famous pessimists like Schopenhauer were very much into Buddhism, and although I've never really deeply studied it, there's definitely some easy to grasp conclusions. It's useful enough to be philosophical, but also vague enough not to be religiously austere. So for me, because I enjoy reading, it's sort of like resonating poetry. But I've always got my skeptical shoes on. So you can imagine my resistance to accepting a process like reincarnation. So if we don't have souls, I overtly reject this process. However, I would imagine reincarnation being, and I've said this before, but it would be as if another person has to live an extremely similar life to mine. I have to live life and make decisions as if it's going to directly affect me. It's a little bit like Kant's categorical imperative. It's a decent foundation anyway, and I can get behind that. I also believe Buddhism lacks strong convictions, and we can't prove reincarnation, souls or otherwise, but we'll just criticize what we can. So, first, I believe there is no free will and everything is deterministic. If there's a plan and we're traveling along, we're strung along a path of fate. What we ought and ought not to do is meaningless. What will happen will happen. But I understand Buddhism teaches that we have some control over our fates, not our circumstances, but our reactions to these circumstances. I believe this to be true as well, and I've mentioned this before. I believe Buddhism actually identifies subjectivity and objectivity really well, despite its ancient origins. I see our universe sort of like playing a game of hot potato. We can hold on to this hot potato and burn ourselves, or we can attempt to throw it away. Unfortunately, the game's rules, they effectively force us to throw it to someone else. So I believe it's our job to get rid of this potato, but you have to discard the game altogether to do so. It's intrinsically linked to the game. So if a state of nirvana is the riddance of this game, I can see the appeal of Buddhism. Now, on the Four Noble Truths, life is suffering. Just the statement, life is suffering. I'm not exactly sure what is meant by life is suffering. It's pretty vague. I would say life is much more full of nothingness and boredom, although I'd say that is a form of suffering. But yes, I'll say that suffering is necessary, and alleviation of this is what we call pleasure, a consequence. In fact, it may be more idoneous to consider suffering as the roots of a thing from where life burgeons forth. Sentient life must grow from feeling, although I'm not sure which came first. Maybe it was both happening at once. On the second noble truth, suffering is caused by craving. Yeah, we become addicted to something because it's a constant escape from suffering. But by engorging ourselves with too much escapism, we begin to cloy at these assumed pleasures. Repetition is intrinsic for improving at things, for learning, or getting better. But we suffer here because we're not learning. We're abusing this tool of repetition as a means to escape. For example, You have a shitty day, you drink away your sorrows. The next time you'll need more alcohol, and so on. But there's nothing being learned by repeating this. Your brain is smacking itself against the wall. And waiting to make use of this repetition, it doesn't. The only thing you're getting better at is wedging yourself deeper into an escape. And eventually you'll have to crawl out of your cave. And the other truths are suffering can have an end, and there is a path which leads to the end of suffering. And I believe this is possible, not just spiritually, but practically. I'll talk more about this in a bit. So on the middle way, what's called the middle way. First, I have to ask what governs these principles of moral conducts of Buddhism, specifically the Eightfold Path. So if we govern ourselves, which is what I would believe here, what's the harm of something like abusive language? And how would violating any of these moral conducts be enforced? How would they affect your nirvana? Now, I'm not a physicist and I aim to stay in my lane here, but how could this bear out in reality, physically? Is there a quantum computer at the basic level writing down your notes? Does it lower your merit level and take you from a bird to a grasshopper from just a few fucking words? So, oops, I guess I'm going to termite now. But I just don't see how this system of nirvana can bear out. Not without some God. And I reject that. I've also mentioned in a previous video subjectivity, objectivity, and absolution. I don't believe nirvana would fall within an absolute state. So think of absolution as encompassing all knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. So absolute truths are beyond subjectivity. Still, this is just a rambling of epistemology, so I'll stop. But back to the Eightfold Path. I can get behind most of these ethics. In fact, I would venture to agree, should some Buddhists point out, that there is objective morality here. There's a value difference between living peacefully and engaging in suffering. What one ought to do, however, is subjective. I suppose it would be, in this system, their decision to elevate their karma or not. They must suffer as long as is required. They must suffer to suffer. That's understandable, but I don't understand certain morals, such as fortune telling and astrology, so it appears there's some antiquated belief still being held here, more than a philosophical statement being made. It would almost be like Christians proselytizing for strict Sabbath measures, like wearing certain fabrics. But I guess Buddhism urges against finding conclusions through other unreliable people. Truth should come from within. Still, there's no strong statements like, nobody can see the future, don't count on it. Just don't even worry. It's more like, I won't refute bullshit deities, but don't be slaves to faded ideas. But for being as old as Buddhism is, we'll give it a pass. Being anti-superstitious that long ago is worth noting. So, with Buddhism's path regarding concentration, these are pretty useful. There's some praise to be had for some level of ascetic behavior. I've always said that I think wastefulness to be a sin, if there should be any one sin, and life is very wasteful. I do believe effort has as much, if not more value than the final product, the product itself. There's usually more work done for something than the appreciation it gets. With focus, if we cannot will what we will, then we ought to attempt to control what the will desires. So even if free will is an entire delusion, we can still act like we have some control. And this introspection may be what changes what is determined. With Buddhists on wisdom, detachments are a no-brainer, I agree. Addiction only leads to greater suffering. This is why I'm anti-life overall. I believe that even though we make advancements, we gain greater knowledge, we increase our overall health and well-being, these are all reasons to discontinue this game of life. All of these things lead to greater amounts of suffering. We have better medicine and higher highs. We live longer, but now that we live longer, we become even more attached, and we have more to lose. We never needed anything until we were born. We only need things because of our finiteness. So we yearn for some utopia. But if what we have right now isn't enough, it'll never be enough. Every today is basically a utopia of yesterday. We wouldn't need things if we lived forever, or if we were non-existent forever. Still, Buddhism advocates for universal love and non-violence. Some violence is necessary, and in fact, inevitable. And sometimes it has to be you. An enemy is nearby, and you have to stop him, it's gotta be you, or he's gonna torture several people. You can say this is an act of compassion, you're doing the right thing. I'm just saying that there is a value judgment that you're making. You do some harm to prevent more harm. But that doesn't take away the fact that you're doing a bad thing. You're valuing an action of -4 for -400. I think what Buddhism doesn't explicitly state, and what it should, is that harm is harm no matter who is suffering. The suffering that a bad person feels still hurts just as much as it would a good person. Karma infers he'll get what he deserves. Well, nobody deserves suffering, because if they weren't here to begin with, they wouldn't be subject to making decisions of good and bad. So, this of course leads to the question of whether karma actually works or not. People might be more inclined to obey karma if they remember their past lives. It appears reincarnation may be a cop-out for people born into a shitty life with no memories. So I believe if you don't have any way to evaluate your past lives, you should start with a clean slate. But Buddhism could just be stating that whether or not this is a fair system, it's just how it is. It's more of an explanation than it is a justification. Now, on Bodhisattvas, excuse my pronunciation, but this is a pretty cool concept here. It might answer some questions as well. So, if Buddhists aim to end all suffering, and they assume they have to play a long game by holding themselves back, so they hold themselves back in order for others to elevate their own reincarnation. I'm just not a fan of exaltation. I feel like a lot of these people would do it for personal ego. Even in their selflessness, they're a bit selfish. But anyway, committing themselves as a sort of living lighthouse, lighting the way for others, escorting those people along the path, okay, there's something noble there. Still, I just don't see how someone could claim to be enlightened and refrain from reaching nirvana. But the idea that we're all servants from previous lives in order to save ourselves is neat, but I feel like we're doing this the wrong way, guys. I feel like it's the wrong way. Leapfrogging each other forward while spawning too many tadpoles along the way doesn't appear to be reducing suffering. In fact, the opposite. Maybe we need to reach a practical point in human history where we can assuredly terminate suffering in one fell swoop. So life is a persistent thing, and we need to make sure we include the animals. Likely, they would need to go first, so the last people can play as Earth's janitors. Now, for weaknesses, Buddhism evades the weak points most religions do, objective claims based in reality, and they can be easily dismissed or refuted. Not so much in Buddhism. It's the closest thing to what an atheist can relate to, I'd suppose. A rejection of worldly things, but also a rejection to any slave-driving deity. So it's persuasive in its structure and ethics. But there are lofty ideas floating from grounded wisdom. Buddhism preceded important discoveries like evolution, and we can now see that many primitive living creatures aren't capable of sentience and suffering. So one has to ask what nirvana really is, and how is it determined in this way? What amount of neurons, for example, would distinguish a creature that is eligible for nirvana and one that isn't? So it also lacks conviction. Although at its origins it would be considered practically impossible, now we could take Buddhism to its logical conclusion, and we could eliminate the cycle of all suffering, if that is indeed its goal, to reach a non-existent state where everyone is completely free of attachments and suffering, ought we not simply phase out our existence? Why must one exist in the first place? Why willingly bring children into a cycle that you know they must escape? How can a believer reconcile bringing more people into this cycle? They have to spend countless reincarnations attempting to escape. So the answer is just to leave them as non-existent. And as far as I'm concerned, non-existence didn't bother me one bit, even if it prevented me from achieving nirvana. You're violating consent to bringing people into this if you're attempting to free their trapped souls. And I reject any notion of the soul until shown evidence anyway. See, we understand the simple process of reproduction. We don't have to perpetuate this cycle by dragging new people here until eventually our sun burns out. So we can see the path at this very moment. I agree on the noble truths, but you're overlooking it. There is indeed a path which leads to the end of suffering. Don't bring more people here. Phase out. Now, I could go even further to steelman a counter response to this, and maybe it was Buddha's his intuition that led him to believe that life is holistically inevitable, and perhaps technically people who have fewer or no children aren't the ones producing progeny, which in turn produce more. And sure, philosophies aren't inherited genetically, but this is also a game of resources. If there's always someone to fill in the void of life, existence could be practically inescapable. But this could just be an archaic belief. So I still advocate for education and reasoning. So far, it seems to be working. Perhaps there is a pathway leading away from suffering. We can agree on the goal here. And it would be interesting to see if humanity ever agreed to pragmatically phase out, and if a dwindling future generation fought against this, and the survivors might retaliate with recidivism. I wonder perhaps if there's a baseline for humanity to continue and repopulate because there's more resources and more land with fewer people to share. Perhaps we'll never see fewer than a couple billion people ever again, save for a catastrophic event. So I'm open to many options right now. I just want to explore every possible solution and what will work, not just philosophically, but realistically. I'm rather pessimistic, or I should say realistic, that an end to all suffering is not practically available soon. But I do see it happening on the horizon. I can actually see it. I do. Eventually, we'll run low on resources. Things have to get bad before they get better. And then they'll still get worse. We won't be able to sustain technology that will throw us beyond our limitations in time. And saying we'll figure it out when we get there is far too optimistic. We can't even use this planet sustainably, let alone other hostile planets' dearth of life. Furthermore, people will just become educated enough. The a priori axiom here is that most people value truth above all else, and they will continue to do so. With higher levels of education, they will be better equipped to reason for non-existence, or at the very least, they'll have fewer children. So nature did not intend, not that it's a conscious thing, but nature accidentally may have weaponized its own creations to be so intelligent as to become hostile to it. Pretty ironic. We'll see what wins out. I've mentioned this before, and I'll make a separate video, but I believe this would be a universal truth deriving from space, time, and causality, even for how rare sentient life is, if there is any. They will have eventually reached an understanding to reach a nirvana, an understanding and an obligation to end the game, if they didn't use all their resources in futility first. The reason we'll probably never find conscious life, so the time and distance it would take to discover them would be far greater than the time it takes for them to come to an understanding and an ability to close their final chapter. I would call this the cosmic graveyard. That's what our universe is. It's also a possible explanation to the Fermi paradox. Even at this moment, other sentient lives are pondering their own existence, and whether they'll gracefully join the graveyard or die out with a whimper. A more terrifying thought is intelligent life without sentience. And I think this is improbable, but it's impossible to tell with our current data set. Still, they wouldn't be obligated to do anything, thinking rocks, for example. If they're doing high-level conceptualization without experiencing pain and suffering, I don't really care what they do. Let them surf around the universe, no problem. It's not that scary, I suppose. Still, who knows? Life is extremely rare, but our universe is immense and ancient. Okay, so this was way off tangent here, and I still need to make a video separately on that, at least on universal graveyard theory. I went from Buddha to aliens, but it's all relevant to the most important aspect of anything in the universe, valuing truth and applying a dignified prescription to it. All right, guys, so if you made it this far, I appreciate it. And let me know what you think. Tell me if I missed anything, any concepts I glossed over, or whether or not my critique was fair. If there is one thing that I'm optimistic about, it's a path to some kind of nirvana. Oh, thank you for listening, and I hope everyone has a great day. Take care.